The River's Daughter, on the surface, appears to be a book about a young woman seeking empowerment through river guiding, but the story that lies beneath is about power structures in the family, the river community, in resort tourist towns, and in colonialism. So we're going to look at how these power structures develop, how they're maintained, and how do we shift them.
Welcome to the Trail Less Traveled, an adventure radio series and podcast dedicated to collecting stories and sounds from around the world in order to take you back to mankind's earliest form of entertainment, storytelling. Missoula, Montana is a mecca for outdoor enthusiasts, and each week we will bring you tales of adventure from both near and far, as well as information and inspiration and a few tunes to set the mood. You can subscribe to the podcast and learn about our international outreach projects at traillesstraveled.net. And now, here's your host, international expedition guide, conservationist, and yogi, Mandela.
Today, the Trail Less Traveled is being recorded in the forest outside Missoula, Montana, and I'm sitting here with Bridget Crocker. She is a trailblazer in women's empowerment within the outdoor industry, a leading whitewater rafting guide in far-flung regions of Zambia, Ethiopia, the Philippines, Peru, Chile, Costa Rica, India, and the Western United States. She lives in Malibu, California, and her recent book, The River's Daughter, just came out. She is in Missoula doing a book tour, and it is quite an honor to sit with her now because we've been connected for over a decade. And I can just say that she has inspired me more than any other woman in this field. And to be able to sit with her in the forest and interview her is certainly something I've been looking forward to for a long time. So I just want to start by saying, Bridget, thank you for setting aside the time and energy to sit with me today, and also for all the ways that you've inspired me over the past 2 decades.
Oh, well, the pleasure is mine. I just love the work that you're doing, Mandela, and I'm so grateful to be here with you and sharing in this way, and it's a long time coming.
Mm-hmm. For those listening, I sincerely encourage you to go ahead and support a local bookshop and buy The River's Daughter. When did that book come out?
June 3rd was our pub date, so it's just over a month now.
Beautiful. Well, let's dive in. My first question for you is, where did you grow up? And how was adventure a part of your childhood?
I love that question. I had the great fortune to grow up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where adventure is woven into just getting to school. It's such an extraordinary place and requires so much in the way of survival skills, just on a basic level. And I grew up in a beautiful trailer park on the banks of the Snake River. And so I would spend a lot of time on the Snake River, just sitting next to the river, just blending into the surroundings. And it was a place where I went to seek refuge and solace and to be nurtured. And that relationship eventually led me into a career as an international river guide. And I began guiding on the Snake Blind Canyon section in the Whitewater section when I was about 20 years old in 1991. Before that, I was also a Girl Scout. My mom was my Girl Scout leader, and we went to real Girl Scout camps all across Wyoming, Montana. My mom was very much an outdoor enthusiast, and as was my stepdad. And they, really set us up with backpacking and camping and survival skills in nature. So all of those things came into play, informing me as an adventurer and as a guide. The Snake River was my first mentor in nature, definitely, and the first place where I felt a deep connection and a place of belonging. I felt that I was cared for there, that I had value, that the snake saw who I really am. And to this day, when I go to the snake, it's like, people spend all kinds of money now doing sound baths, right? To get in alignment, to align their chakras with the sound. And I feel that way when I'm sitting next to the snake. I feel just so aligned and attuned to the sounds and to the feeling and the vibration from the Snake River. Having just been there last week on book tour, I spent a couple of days and one very special afternoon in my secret spot where I used to go as a kid, and just laid down and just watched the bald eagles overhead circling around and remembering how I used to love being there because I just felt free of all the burdens of being a kid and growing up the way I did with so much instability between my households and enduring a lot of shaming at school for living, in a state of poverty, which is something that a lot of people experience in outdoor towns, tourist towns. There's the haves and the have-nots, and my family was in the service industry, so we were part of the have-not crew and always working super hard to just, make ends meet. And the pressure of that was a lot on my family. So being able to just kind of relax next to the Snake River and just be a girl without the pressures of families falling apart and being deeply entrenched in the process of overcoming the cycles of poverty and abuse that had plagued my family for generations. And my parents both did a lot of heavy lifting on that and working hard to overturn those cycles. But, there's still echoes of it in each generation. And so being able to have a break from that and to just blend into nature. I heard an interview with Jane Goodall recently where she was asked, what's it like to take people out into the woods and guide them? And how do you connect people with nature? And she had this very eloquent response of saying, when I'm with other people in nature, I'm very focused on the people and like trying to get them and connect with them and kind of being a translator. But when I'm alone in nature, I kind of can blend into and become nature. And I feel that way very much. And just when I'm alone and quiet and just focused on my surroundings, I lose the burden of being human. I get to connect in that deeper way. And it feels like such a peaceful homecoming to be in that space. I had a lot of difficult things happen to me between the ages of 14 and 17, and I had a lot to overcome there. And I ended up being involved with a guy who was a river guide, and he was working on the Snake River. Before that, he was working on the Kern River in California, and I went to visit him on the Kern. And the Kern is in Southern California. It's the closest river to Los Angeles, and it's east of Bakersfield. And it actually drains the western slope of the Southern Sierras, and it drains Mount Whitney, which is the highest mountain, the tallest mountain in the lower 48 states. So the Kern is this really special river. And when I was there, I'd been told by my mother that I wasn't allowed to go in the river, that if I fell in the river, I would die. And I had this experience when I was young of falling into the Snake River and not dying. And the river yelling out to me as I was, being swept downstream that I should swim. Because sometimes when I would disappear into my surroundings, I could hear the voice of the river. I could communicate with the river. And so that experience and ability started to develop and grew as I grew and worked on that relationship. So when I got to the Kern River, there was a period of the trip where there was a swim rapid where people were encouraged to jump into the river on purpose and swim through this little rapid and then swim to shore. And I was like, what? No, if you fall in the river, you're going to die. That was like so hardwired into my brain. And I ended up going along with it, jumping into the river, swimming, and having the most fun I've ever had in my life, and just being completely filled with joy and just jubilant at this experience and this development, and realizing like, oh, I could become a river guide, like, my boyfriend and these other people on the trip, and thinking that would be the most incredible thing that I could possibly do, and the thing that I felt that I was born to do. Once I discovered that, it was like, oh, well, this is my calling and this is my birthright. I will be a river guide. And then I came back to my hometown, Jackson, Wyoming, and went to a guide school in the Snake River. And that was interesting and difficult because I was one of 5 women in the guide school out of 25 people. And I felt very inadequate. I remember feeling like I'm not going to be strong enough to do this. I'm not going to be competent. I'm not going to know what to say or do. I just felt like everybody else was better suited to this. I felt very insecure and apprehensive about doing it. And then I remembered, oh yeah, I'm good friends with the Snake River. I can communicate with the river, and I should communicate and see if that helps me know where to go, and I can rely on that relationship. So there's a little section here in my book I want to read for you. Just the first time that I attempt this, to use this relationship, to lean on this relationship to guide. And like, is this going to be a viable option for me? So in guide school, we did this flip drill, and it was super cold. I mean, the guide school happens in late May. So in Jackson, that means it's snowing. And this was, kind of pre-dry suits. There weren't really even dry suits. A lot of people didn't have them. I didn't even know about dry suits. So we had wetsuits. But I mean, the water was like, high 40s, very, very cold, ice melt, spring runoff. And you have to do this flip drill where, we flip the boat over on purpose and swim underneath it and then pull yourself back up on top and then pull up everybody and then flip the boat back over and get everybody back in the boat. And so I was, super terrified of doing this. But I was very surprised to find I was the first one back up on the top of the boat and pulling everybody up. And, that was kind of the first encouraging thing. And then this little section I want to read to you starts the day after the flip drill. The day after the flip drill, 2 students dropped out, both women. The snake was flowing at a volume of over 30,000 cubic feet per second, CFS. A cubic foot is around the size of a basketball, and the force of the water, equivalent to 30,000 balls passing the same point each second, instilled legitimate fear in our group. By comparison, the upper current had been about 1,000 CFS the day Nicolette Sheridan was injured. The whitewater in the current was rated more technical due to the many obstacles, but the higher volume snake was colder, with water temperatures in the mid-40s. The snake was fast enough to sweep you a half-mile away from the boat in under a minute, and cold enough to kill you in 6. That day, the snake's most formidable rapid, lunch counter, had 2 solid lateral waves capable of flipping a boat or dumping paddlers. Hours earlier, I'd watched Clint, a college quarterback looking for a cool summer job, puke off the stern before captaining the raft into the rapid's laterals at the wrong angle, sending the entire left side of paddlers swimming. They were retrieved a quarter-mile downstream after several minutes and would have to sit out the rest of the day in the bus, warming up. After witnessing Clint's run, I dreaded my turn. "Local girl, let's see what you got," Morgan said to me as we entered Blind Canyon, just upstream from lunch counter. I made my way to the stern and took my seat on the back left tube across from Morgan. As we drifted, I dipped my hand into the water and asked the snake for help. "Show me the way." I rubbed water onto the back of my neck and my forehead, then put my paddle in the water while scanning the rapid before us. I saw a small crease in the first lateral wave and felt a tug in my stomach, indicating that I should aim the raft at the crease. "Left turn," I called. Then, when we were lined up, I said, "Stop." All we needed was momentum. "Forward!" The crew dug in, and we built speed toward the breaking wave. From the stern, I held my paddle in the water, bracing it against my hip like a rudder to maintain the angle. We took the hit squarely and crested toward the top of the lateral before sliding off to the right with the funneling surge. I needed to strengthen my angle to stay perpendicular to the wave train, so I called another left turn, all the while cranking back paddles from the left stern. The boat shifted, and we aligned in the center of the wave train. It was a textbook run. Morgan looked over at me, beaming. "That's it, sister." He held up his hand for a high five. After the elation subsided, I slipped my hand back into the snake. "Thank you," I whispered. I knew she was the reason for my success.
If you're listening, you probably also know that I work as a river guide, and I wanted to tie in a little bit of my experiences as a guide over the past 20 years and some of the work that Bridget continues to do when it comes to women's empowerment within the outdoor industry. So I'll be vulnerable with the listeners and say that as a guide, I've experienced some challenges out there that weren't necessarily what you would imagine first and foremost, like big water out there or ice or crocodiles. Yes. Yeah, those are some things that we encounter on the river from time to time, depending on the locality of said river. But sometimes the most challenging dynamic, now to be honest with you, often the most challenging dynamic for me over the years has been humans. And sometimes those humans are the ones I work with. And that can come in many different forms, and sexual harassment. And so I wanted to kind of start by reading a paragraph from Bridget's book that resonated with me and handing it over to Bridget to talk about power dynamics. Because when I read this to you, you might think we're talking about skill sets when it comes to reading water, but actually there's a lot more to it. Steve shook his head before explaining that water behaved the same no matter the river. So the best guides didn't memorize rapids or runs, but instead recognized features as they approached from upstream. He told me that guides from Northern California were exceptional at reading water because they ran so many different rivers rather than the same section over and over. Their strength was in their ability to adapt. Apparently, many of the world's best guides came from NorCal. I'm going to hand this over to you now, Bridget, and ask you a little bit about that part of the book.
Yeah, so that section is in the chapter Born Again, where I go rafting on the Kern River for the first time. And, on the surface, it seems like I'm talking about reading water, but I'm really talking about power structures. And that's what this book really is about. It's my story of growing up as a girl along the banks of the Snake River and becoming a river guide, and that skill set and experience empowering me to guide rivers all over the world. And then those rivers and the things that they teach me allow me to return back to my family, particularly my father, to overcome multi-generational cycles of abuse and poverty. So on the surface, it's, this story of redemption and growth, but also all of the themes and all of the arcs in this book are really about power dynamics. Who has power and how do we shift power? And part of shifting power is being able to recognize obstacles in the path of the main current flowing downstream, which is all of our collective energy. So being able to read those currents accurately comes from experience, right? And I think my goal in writing this was to illustrate and to use my story as an illustration of how do we navigate power dynamics within our family systems, and how do we navigate those dynamics in, say the river guiding industry, my crew on the river, then the industry, and then going further out, in mountain towns like Jackson Hole, where I grew up. How do those power dynamics shift, and who's affected in what ways? And also going out even further into the global community, looking at colonialism and the vestiges of that, which is what I found when I went to Zambia and was on the Zambezi River, and becoming aware of, in a very real sense, of those dynamics. And what I discovered is it's really all the same thing. It's all the same river, and recognizing that structure and how do we navigate within that structure, not just for survival, but how can we begin to shift the structure so that more people benefit from it, is something that I became very fascinated with. And I'm a closet anthropologist. I went to the University of Montana in Missoula, and I studied English and anthropology. And then I took 4 years off during the time I was in Africa. And when I came back, I finished at Montana State University in Bozeman with a degree in English literature and a minor in Native American studies. And so, I'm fascinated by culture and by how we organize ourselves and how power is disseminated in a group. And is it possible to shift that power? And if so, how do we adapt? What are the lessons there that we can take from experience and share with each other, or just utilize on our own for survival? And I found myself a lot of times as the only woman on a crew of men, having to be incredibly adaptable and employ a certain skill set just to stay safe and to not be othered, made separate from the group. It's very hard to integrate into a group where you're the only one, where you're the token, right? You're the token woman or the token anybody. And to integrate, you have to kind of lose a part of yourself. You have to abandon parts of yourself in the interest of survival within that group. And I felt that way within my family, that I had to give up parts of myself to fit in, and that I couldn't be me and be in my family. I felt that same way as a guide, that I couldn't be all the parts of Bridget and be in a crew that was very interested in control and dominance and one-upmanship that happens, and these constant alpha throwdowns, who's the top dog, and having to navigate that situation as a woman. There are 3 tools that I employed as a guide on these crews. One was being the protege, finding the mentor on the crew that I could kind of go to for education, and they were able to teach me things about the landscape, but it was also in the interest of protection, because they were usually the oldest, most secure within the company, and I could kind of go under their wing and be protected. So that was my favorite tool, the protege, because nobody really got hurt until maybe the mentor decided that they wanted to make that relationship romantic, and in which case I employed the second skill set, which was have a boyfriend. I always had a boyfriend. He usually wasn't there, but if I was going to, cheat on my boyfriend, I would certainly be with you, but it's not going to happen because I've got this boyfriend and you understand. And so then it would be, I could blame the boyfriend and not have to say like, I'm not interested in your advances. So I could still stay in the good graces of the mentor. There's also another skill set that gets employed. I tried to not use this one, but sometimes I would have to. And that's being the flirt and, wielding sexual power, which is never ideal for me. And there's a section in the book, which we talked about, which I think we might want to read, where I first met somebody who was not using sexual power, a woman in a position of leadership. And it really blew my mind because I'd never really experienced that. I grew up in an era where the generation ahead of me didn't have much power aside from sexual power. Women weren't allowed to have a credit card until 1973 or get a bank loan. So you really had this very small box with which to operate and to have any kind of leverage or effect. And that was one of the biggest tools that they had to wield, and also one of the ones that they passed down to my generation as a way to navigate. And so when I was confronted with someone who did not participate in that transaction, I was stunned. And this is in the chapter Born Again. Never had I seen a woman stand her ground among men so unapologetically or effectively, and certainly not while wearing a bikini. Unlike my mother and aunt, Melissa did not employ her sexuality as currency. She advanced by using direct language and actions, and I immediately decided that this was the kind of woman I wanted to be. Yeah, so when I went to the Kern River and met Melissa, there's a scene where she's been training to be a guide on the Class 5 section, the Forks of the Kern, which is this amazing wilderness run through the Golden Trout Wilderness that directly drains Mount Whitney. And there's something like 46 Class 5 and 4+ rapids in a very short period. It's like a 3-day trip. So she's been training on this section for a couple of years, and she's still not being scheduled on it. And so one of the first things that happens when I get to the Kern and I sit down and I'm kind of observing the scene at the guide house, which is this whole microcosm of culture that I have not been exposed to before. And here comes Melissa, and she storms into the manager's office and demands to have her name put on the schedule with all these guys. And, she says, and here's another tool that has worked really well for me in navigating sexual harassment and, just being targeted and retaliation and all the things that come with sexual harassment. Humor and one-liners. And being raised in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and being just a Wyomingite, we're very well versed in giving and taking shit. And so that was something that I could take from my childhood and apply to situations on the river where, I can dish it out. And I saw Melissa do that too, where she goes in and she's like, what's the deal? I've been training on this river for 2 years. Surely I thought I'd be on the schedule by now. And, she says, like, do I need to grow a dick to be on this river? Because I can do that if that's what's required, And then she gets her name put on the schedule. And somebody says, squeaky wheel gets the grease. I remember I could see her face, and I remember her just flipping that person off with her eyes. Like, I have 2 daughters, and a lot is said about teenage girls and eye roll. Teenage girls roll their eyes. She didn't roll her eyes, but she used her eyes in a way to communicate something, because we're socialized to not be able to use our voices, not be able to use our bodies. What we have to use is our eyes. And teenage girls roll their eyes because they don't feel safe to be able to say what's really on their mind. And so whenever my kids are rolling their eyes, I try to dig deeper into, what's that about and what are they not saying and what do they not feel safe about. That was such an awakening for me to see Melissa come in, and this incredible scene of this woman she did it in a way that wasn't confrontational. She used humor. She diffused the situation, but she stood her ground and she got the result. She had to deal with the backlash, which is always part of it, the retaliation. And that's a skill set that as a woman guide I've had to learn how to employ. And that is, like, how do I be comfortable in the uncomfortability? And that's a skill that I've learned from the river. When you're in the midst of a huge ass rapid, like, how do you be comfortable in the uncomfortability? It's the same thing in these power dynamics and struggles and navigating that on land.
So, Bridget, We have quite a lot in common, and I'm realizing that more and more as I sit in the forest with you, and we chatted for over an hour before we even started recording. We're wearing the same necklace today. Mine is made out of wood, and yours is made out of silver, yes. So I'm wondering if you could tell the listener about who we're wearing around our neck, and to honor Nyami, and to talk about the mighty river Zambezi.
Yes, I think that is probably what brought us together, was our love of the Zambezi. And Nyami is the river god of the Zambezi and the Tonga tradition. He is half crocodile, half serpent, and he is the presence, the energy, the being that inhabits the Zambezi River, which is the fourth largest river in Africa. When I went to Zambia, I was 20 years old. And before that, I had always dreamed of going to Africa. There was a period where I lived in California as a teenager with my father, and I'd set up this sort of like safe space in my closet, and I had ripped out pictures of the savanna, of African wildlife, and taped it up all inside my closet. And I had made a vow and a promise to myself that one day I would escape and I would go to Zambia. Well, not specifically Zambia, but Africa and the Serengeti. I ended up in Zambia, and I was hired initially to guide canoe safaris on the lower Zambezi. I received a job offer via fax in 1991. So I went to and worked on the section below Lake Kariba out of Siavanga. And what I had been totally naive and ill-prepared for as a girl who'd grown up in the States and in Wyoming in particular, was that there were white people in Africa. That never crossed my mind. I had no idea about it. I'd never been taught about it in school, about colonialism, about Rhodesia, about northern Rhodesia where I was. And it wasn't until I got there and I started researching the area where I was going that I realized that there'd been this long history of British colonial rule in Zambia, which had formerly been northern Rhodesia, and was the first African nation where they overturned white minority rule in 1968, and it was done without bloodshed. So it was quite an amazing accomplishment. And so by the time I got there, Kenneth Kaunda, who'd been the one to lead that transition of power, he had been in power now for 28 years when I got there. And people were very disenchanted with the corruption that had happened, how there were long lines for cooking oil, for just basic, they call it nshima, which is ground cornmeal that they use as staple with every meal that they eat. Someone had told me at the time that Kenneth Kaunda was one of the 10 richest leaders in the world, presidents, and that Zambia was one of the 10 poorest nations in the world simultaneously. I could see that. And just the echoes and the vestiges of racism was so rampant, and I was so not prepared for that. I ended up reading a little bit of Doris Lessing and was able to understand it a little bit more from reading her book, The Grass is Singing, which I recommend to everyone. But what I did recognize and understood was the dynamic of power, right? And I recognized the shame, and I recognized tactics of humiliation and of degradation. And these are the same tactics that I experienced growing up in a dysfunctional home where there was violence, domestic violence. And there was radical gaslighting, there was denial, there was scapegoating. And these were all things that I saw and recognized very easily within colonialism, the system of colonialism, and also on the river as a guide. In the training, I was training some young Zambian men to be canoe safari guides, and working with my manager and boss was somebody who'd been a mercenary in the Rhodesian War and had some very pointed and difficult ideas about how to treat people of different races, incredibly racist. Using the little tools that I had at 20 years old, coming from a dysfunctional family and being othered in that family, to now being smack in the middle of this colonial structure, it was easy for me to want to stand up for other people in a way that I couldn't stand up for myself growing up. And I learned in that situation that often the best way to stand up is just to be an ally and to support and to make sure that you're helping in a way that is helpful to the people who are needing assistance. So I learned a lot. I had a lot of missteps where I kind of insert myself in these situations and sometimes make them more dangerous, And I realized that I had no business really trying to save other people when I couldn't save myself. So that was a real turning point for me in learning how to look at the structure and look at my place in it. And you can't give away what you don't have, right? So if I'm not empowered and able to navigate the world coming from a place where I'm free, I can't impose that expectation or, ideal onto other people. That was one thing that I learned from my time there. And another was just, here I'd come from the Snake River that was this lovely, maternal, kind, gentle, nurturing river. I thought and assumed that the Zambezi would be similar, but more paternal towards me. And what I found was I couldn't deny it from the very beginning. I felt a malevolent, foreboding voice and being. And I was like, no, maybe, I'm just losing something in the cultural translation. I'm really far away from home and maybe I'm just not getting it right. And it became very obvious as time went by that no, the Zambezi and Nyami were pissed. They were very, very angry. Nyami was super angry. When I asked my Zambian friends about this, and actually it kind of came to a head where I was having an argument with Nyami. I thought no one was watching, and I was having this argument with Nyami on the side of the river, and one of my friends came up and saw me, a Tonga man, and he said, "Are you talking to Nyami?" And I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "You can hear him?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Have you been trained for this?" And I said, "No, not properly. I know that people can do this, but I haven't been trained properly by anybody. And it's just something that, is there, and I kind of keep to myself because in my culture, if you're talking to rivers, people think you're crazy." So, I said, "It seems to me that he's very angry." And he said, "Yeah, he's super angry because the dam at Lake Kariba had been built and separated him from his wife, Kitapo. And so he was incredibly enraged." And I learned from that anger is hurt's bodyguard and rage is really a cover-up for grief. And that allowed me to think about my own father, who had a serious rage problem, and to see that the possibility that maybe it wasn't about the rage, but more about the grief underneath, and to become curious about that grief for the first time. I just kind of written him off he's this guy who's abusive, he's got this rage problem, he's off the rails, all of these things, and just write him off. And we had been estranged for many years. And another thing happened, a dear friend had been killed on the Zambezi. And I was there when his father was told that he had died. And the rage that this father had. And it was so clear that the rage was about grief. So I started to wonder, what's the grief underneath my dad's rage? And went back to the States and went to my father and invited him to go on the Kern River with me, where we were able to reconnect and have some really difficult discussions about what had happened, about the rage, about the mistreatment and the domestic violence. And, he asked for another opportunity to be the father that I deserved. And in river guiding, when you look at the obstacle on the river, that's where your boat's going to go. Wherever you look on the river, that's where your boat's going to go. So if you're looking at the obstacle, you're looking at a big, huge rock in the current, you're going to hit that rock and you're going to flip on it. I'm learning that it's the same in relationships. If you're fixated on the obstacle and what happened and what they did to me, and you just stay stuck in the problem and you flip on it, and there's no way to go downstream. The way to get downstream is to look at the water going around the obstacle and put your boat there. And so I realized sometimes it takes a lot of courage, because you want to look at this obstacle and be like, oh, look at that huge rock, don't go there. And it's all you can really look at. But to not look at the thing that's the obvious thing, but to look at what's underneath it or going around it and put your boat there takes you downstream further. You get to keep going another day. And so that's what the beauty of the Zambezi and the gift that I got from that river was the reconnection with my father, the greater understanding of the story, seeing things from a different perspective, which I think is so essential, especially now for us, where we are as a culture. Just so many people are so unwilling to consider another person's point of view, that it might be different. And our perceptions, they're not locked in stone, just like a river. We don't have to stay connected to these perceptions. And in fact, that's how we stay stuck. and not going downstream, is to just lock into these perceptions of things, how things are, and they're these absolutes. But when we can be curious about, maybe there's more to this story that I don't know, or maybe I don't have it right, or maybe I'm not seeing things from a different perspective, and to give that a chance. I think there's so much more growth to be had, and understanding and unity, which is something that we need so much right now.
That's the voice of Bridget Crocker. She is a trailblazer in women's empowerment within the outdoor industry. She has guided whitewater rafting expeditions all over the world, and we were just talking about her time on the Zambezi. Bridget, I really appreciate the fact that you brought Kitapo into the story, because it seems like much of the attention goes to Nyami, and Kitapo is also a very powerful guardian of the Zambezi. She's known for being the guardian of the Zambezi from the Kariba Dam all the way to where it empties into the Indian Ocean. I want to start to loop this back and find a way to finish this conversation for now. I have about 400 million other questions, and I hope to visit you and your daughters and your husband where you live in Malibu to continue the conversation, because we have many, many more rivers and topics to talk about. But I was hoping you could maybe speak to someone listening out there who is perhaps a river guide and they're facing some challenges, and maybe the challenge is fixation on a rapid that they've struggled with and they can't stop thinking about it. And as you and I both know, it doesn't really help if you think about it up until the point where you're actually scouting it or dropping into it. Or maybe they're dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace. So maybe you are sitting with that person in the forest right now. What would you share with them?
Yeah, that's such a great question and place to kind of bring us all together. And it's so important to know that you're not alone, that you're not going through this alone, that there's other people who have experienced this and who are talking about it, who are willing to mentor and talk about it. We're as sick as our secrets. So when we keep those secrets, we continue to perpetuate the sickness and the misuse of power. When we're able to release those secrets, which aren't ours to carry, I write in my book that I've been poisoned to the point of allergy from carrying other people's bad choices. And there was a point where I just couldn't continue to be sick from that anymore, and I had to release it. So when we release those secrets, amazing things happen, and you don't know where it's going to lead. For example, in a relationship with Mandela that has spanned over a decade. And I think that sparked with me releasing the secret and writing an essay about my experiences with sexual harassment in the river guiding community. And, all of these changes that are happening, like I was approached by a river ranger on the Snake River who had read that essay that I wrote and said, I was the river ranger at the time that you were experiencing these things on the Snake River, and I was responsible for taking care of you during that. And what I'd like to know is, what could I have done to help you? And that conversation sparked, 6 months of us going through what he could have done or what could have been done that would have been helpful to me at that time. And that became protocol that was implemented for a time among all federal rivers in the United States. And you just told me that you had to have mandatory sexual harassment training and experienced the implementation of me revealing a secret, right? When we can step into our truth and realize that it's not my story, it's our story, it's everybody's story. And if we can have the courage to change and adapt collectively to that, we can shift the power and shift the experience. So I just want to encourage people, just in the same way that when you scout a rapid, as I'm walking back to the boat, I always go down and look at the entrance from the river level so I don't get lost as I'm going in. Look at things from more than one perspective and have faith that, ultimately we push offshore and we leave the results up to the river, right? Whether we're upside down or right side up at the bottom, we can do our best to enter and navigate our best during the run, but it's ultimately up to the river, whether we're upright or not at the bottom. And, we just have to have faith that in the same way, to let the courage to even get in the boat and push offshore be the thing that leads us and guides us.
And my last question for you is to do with courage. I love one of Eleanor Roosevelt's quotes, do one thing every day that scares you. So I wanted to ask you about something that you might share with someone listening who is facing a new journey in life, whether it's a career change or learning how to read and run rivers. At the beginning of this interview, you talked about that shift that happened where your mom said to stay out of the river, that it will kill you if you fall in. And then you went for a safe swim in a section that was safe to swim, and you had the most fun ever. So I just kind of wanted to talk to you about, you can relate it to someone who's learning how to read and run whitewater, whether it's for pleasure or for work, or just someone who's leaning into trying something new, whatever that is.
Yeah, well, imagine how different my life would be if I just stayed in that statement that if you fall in the river, you will die, and just let that rule my life. Imagine if I hadn't considered or been open to the idea and the possibility that that might not be true all the time. And, took the opportunity and had the courage to try and to be teachable. I think that's the key thing is to, how can I be teachable when I'm trying something new? How can I surrender to something new? Not in a jump off a cliff kind of way, but in a way you're trying on and adapting. I mean, it's all really about adaptability, right? Adapting to new circumstances, like the evolution of how we do things, as a culture has changed so much. Like we don't use rotary phones anymore, we don't hitch up the wagon to get to town anymore. Like things change and adapt, and approaching new things and being confronted with new information and technology and situations, and especially when traveling, new cultures. And I've seen so many people do this where it's like, nope, I'm going to only eat hamburgers, because that's what I know and it's safe. I'm only going to eat at McDonald's or whatever when I go to Europe. And you're just really robbing yourself of the cultural richness and connection that comes from trying new things and being teachable. So I would just encourage anybody who's shifting, and transitions are always difficult, right? Transitioning from the eddy into the main current, switching gears is always a challenge, and it requires faith and a strong angle. Like to go over an eddy fence and to switch currents, you need a strong angle, so the intention needs to be clear, and you need momentum, and that requires just active listening, doing of the thing, and surrendering.
Once again, if you are interested in continuing to learn from Bridget, please support your local bookshop. If you're in Missoula, fact and fiction, you can pick up The River's Daughter by Bridget Crocker. She's a trailblazer in women's empowerment within the outdoor industry. Bridget, thank you so much for your time and energy joining me here today on The Trail Less Traveled.
Thank you so much for having me and for hosting me in your beautiful forest here. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Hello, my name is Kellen Beck, and I am the Development Director at the Montana Natural History Center. Our mission is to promote and cultivate the appreciation, understanding, and stewardship of nature through education. My naturalist tip of the week is all about lichen, the ultimate survivalist. Lichens are those crusty, leafy, or brushy growths on rocks and trees, and they aren't a single organism, but a partnership between fungus and an algae or cyanobacterium. They survive in extreme environments and are key indicators of air quality. Some lichen species in Montana are hundreds of years old and can even be used to estimate tree age on old-growth snags.
That's it for this week's adventure, my friends in Missoula and around the world. But until next week, please remember, conservation is not a spectator sport. Living in Missoula is a privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. Please get educated and engaged. Speak up on behalf of wildlife and wild places. And if you think you're too small to make a difference, well then you've never spent the night with a mosquito.